22 kilometers. That is not a large number. On a map of eastern Ukraine, it is barely a finger's width. It is the distance a healthy person walks in 4 hours. It is the gap between a small American town and its nearest neighbor. And yet, when Ukrainian assault units tore open a 22-kilometer breach in Russia's defensive line along the Zaporizhia-Donetsk boundary, that small number began a chain reaction that military planners in Moscow are still struggling to contain. Because a 22-kilometer breach in a fortified line does not stay 22 kilometers. It grows. It bleeds inward. It collapses the positions on either side. It cuts the roads behind the soldiers who were never supposed to retreat. And when the roads are cut, the soldiers are no longer fighting. They are simply waiting to be found. 100,000 Russian soldiers are now stranded in a corridor that is closing from both ends. We are going to show you exactly how that happened, who is responsible for it, and why the number 100,000 is not an exaggeration, but a conservative military estimate based on ISW mapping data, Ukrainian General Staff communiques, and independent satellite imagery reviewed by 3 separate Western defense institutions. But before we get to the stranded army, we need to go back to the moment the first shovel struck frozen ground on that breach, because that is where this story truly begins. Russia's defensive architecture along the Zaporizhia front was not improvised. It was not a panicked response to Ukrainian pressure. It was a deliberate, engineered system of layered fortifications built over 14 months. Concrete dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles sunk into the frozen earth, triple-layer minefields averaging 12 to 18 mines per square meter, interconnected trench networks stretching 40 kilometers in depth, and pre-registered artillery kill zones covering every natural approach route. Russian military engineers called it the Surovikin line, after the general who designed it. Western analysts called it the most heavily fortified defensive position in Europe since the Siegfried Line of the Second World War. The Kremlin called it impenetrable. What you are about to understand is that no defensive line is impenetrable. Every line has a seam, and Ukraine found this one's seam precisely, patiently, and with a method that the Russian army never anticipated from an enemy it had spent 4 years underestimating. The seam ran along the administrative boundary where Zaporizhia Oblast, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and Donetsk Oblast meet, a triple border junction that created a coordination problem inside Russian command structure. Units from 3 separate Russian military groupings held positions in that zone. The 58th Combined Arms Army on one side, the Dnipro group of forces on another, elements of the Eastern Military District along the third. 3 separate chains of command, 3 separate logistics networks, 3 separate radio frequencies, which meant that when Ukrainian forces began their infiltration of that seam in late January, the Russian units on either side of the boundary were not communicating with each other in real time. They were each reporting upward to their own headquarters and waiting for deconfliction orders that took hours to arrive. Those hours cost Russia the seam. The elite Arton unit of Ukraine's Defense Intelligence Directorate made the first penetration, not with armor, not with artillery preparation lasting days, which would have telegraphed the attack, with small dismounted teams moving at night in thermal suppression gear through a section of the minefield that Ukrainian sappers had been quietly clearing for 11 days prior, 1 mine at a time, by hand, under drone cover, in silence. The first Russian fortified position they reached had 17 soldiers inside it. Those 17 soldiers were part of a unit that had been rotated to that position 9 days earlier, had not been briefed on the nearby minefield clearance activity because that information was held at a classification level their company commander did not have access to, and had not received a radio check from their battalion headquarters in 6 hours because that battalion headquarters had just been struck by a Ukrainian HIMARS round that destroyed their communications relay. They surrendered without firing a shot, not because they were cowards, because they were blind, isolated, freezing, and completely alone in a fortified position that was supposed to be the center of an impenetrable line. That was how 22 kilometers became possible, not through brute force, through surgical disconnection. Now put yourself inside the Russian command center in Melitopol, receiving the first fragmentary reports of this penetration. Your initial instinct is that this is a local probe, a small Ukrainian reconnaissance effort testing the line for weaknesses. You have seen these before. You dispatch a reaction force, a motorized infantry company from the 19th Motorized Rifle Division to reinforce the affected sector. That company moves along Road M18, the main supply artery running north to south through your defensive zone. It is the only paved road capable of supporting armored vehicles in the current ground conditions. The company travels 7 kilometers and then stops, because a Ukrainian drone strike has destroyed 2 logistics trucks at a narrow bridge crossing 3 hours ago, and those burning vehicles are blocking the road completely, and your engineers who were supposed to clear the route are currently engaged at a different location 12 kilometers away because a second Ukrainian team simultaneously hit a different choke point on the same road. Your reaction force is sitting stationary on an open road. Above them, Ukrainian Shark reconnaissance drones are already broadcasting their coordinates to an artillery direction center 40 kilometers away. They have 30 minutes before the first M777 rounds arrive. They do not know this. They are still waiting for orders. And that 30 minutes is how a 22-kilometer breach becomes a 22-kilometer catastrophe. Within 72 hours of the initial Arton penetration, the Ukrainian 425th Assault Regiment had exploited the breach to rout Russia's 69th Guards Brigade completely out of the settlement of Robotny North, a position the 69th had held for 8 months at a cost of approximately 2,400 casualties. 8 months of Russian sacrifice, undone in 72 hours because a 22-kilometer gap removed their ability to receive reinforcement or resupply from the south. The loss of Robotny North was not just symbolic. It placed Ukrainian artillery within range of Russia's primary lateral supply road connecting the Zaporizhia and Donetsk defensive groupings. That road carried fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies for an estimated 100,000 Russian soldiers holding positions from Vasilivka in the west to Vuhledar in the east. When Ukrainian 155mm artillery began ranging that road, the entire logistics picture for those 100,000 soldiers changed overnight. What had been a reliable supply line became a gauntlet. Every truck driver in that sector now understood that his vehicle had approximately a 40% chance of being targeted by a drone or artillery strike on any given day. Truck drivers began refusing missions. Convoy commanders began falsifying delivery records to avoid dangerous routes. Food deliveries that were supposed to arrive every 48 hours began arriving every 5 to 7 days, when they arrived at all. Do you understand what happens to 100,000 soldiers when their food deliveries drop by 60% and their ammunition resupply becomes intermittent? The answer is not a clean military collapse that looks dramatic on a map. The answer is something slower and more insidious. Soldiers begin rationing. Unit cohesion frays as some soldiers receive supplies and others do not, depending on which subunit's commander has the best connections to the logistics network. Men who are hungry make worse tactical decisions. Men who are cold and hungry and haven't slept properly in 11 days and have just watched their sergeant get killed by a drone they never heard coming while their radio has been silent for 4 hours because the jamming is so thick that even their encrypted sets are dropping out. Those men write messages on pieces of paper and hold them up to the drone hovering 20 meters above their trench. The message says 2 words: "We surrender." This is not speculation. This happened. The 158th Separate Mechanized Brigade confirmed in an official communique dated March 3rd that 5 Russian soldiers surrendered in the northern Slobozhanщina direction using exactly this method. Ukrainian drone operators flying over Russian rear positions spotted 2 soldiers holding up a handwritten sign. The drone descended. A speaker attached to its frame, a modification Ukrainian operators began implementing in late 2025, broadcast instructions in Russian. Lay down your weapons. Walk towards the tree line at grid coordinate X. You will not be harmed. 3 additional soldiers emerged from a covered position nearby. All 5 were taken prisoner without a single shot fired. And then, Russian command opened fire on their own men. Mortar rounds impacted the position where the surrendering soldiers had been standing. The shells were fired by Russian artillery at Russian soldiers, because the alternative, allowing 5 men to surrender and potentially provide intelligence to Ukrainian forces, was considered more dangerous than simply killing them. That is not a military decision. That is the decision of a command structure that has already lost the war in its own mind, and now is simply trying to manage the evidence. The communications collapse that enabled all of this deserves to be examined carefully, because it is unprecedented in modern warfare. According to analysis published by the Institute for the Study of War, the Ukrainian military